Okay, it is Tuesday, December 8th at 7:02 p.m. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Policy and Services Committee. If the clerk would please take the roll.
Yes, of course. Mayor Fine,
Here.
Councilmember Filsa,
Here.
Councilmember Koo,
Here.
3 present.
Thank you so much. Our first order of business is oral communications, where any member of the public may speak to items not on the agenda. I see we have about 7 attendees, and if the clerk would please help these folks provide comments if they wish to do so. And just for the record, I'm just stepping in this meeting for Councilmember Cormack.
Yes, of course. So if you're on your Zoom map or Zoom app, please raise your hand if you would like to speak an item that is not on the agenda. If you're on your phone, please press *9. All right, we have one person, Rebecca Eisenberg. All right, I'm going to allow you to speak and we'll provide you 2 minutes. If you can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to address this group, and I'm very grateful for all of your hard work. I recognize that one of the conversations today are about setting priorities for next year. So I don't want to be, but rather, if this is on topic, I think I'd like to propose that if not, that if it's within your group's purview, to maybe give a thought to how to improve the processes in which our policies are implemented. For example, I think it's important that someone think about methods of reducing, ideally eliminating conflict of interest at city council level and also on the commissions. There seem to be kind of loose rules that are self-reported and often no consequence if they are violated. To the extent there are consequences, I don't think that they're enforced consistently, although I don't think there are consequences. Although of course there are state rules regarding that. We're Palo Alto and have one of the most educated populations in the country, if not world. I think that we can strive to achieve best in class here. Sorry, my cat's crying in the background. I do feed him though. The other thing I hope is that if you could take a look at how we can run meetings more efficiently and more effectively and also more fair. Other similar jurisdictions have a position known as a parliamentarian that often sheds important light to the reasons behind the rules. I think I might be muted, but if you can hear me, I think it might be nice for us to, oh, there we go. Anyway, I know I just fell offline, but I think it might be helpful to explore that too. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Aaron James. I'm allowing you to speak. You'll have 2 minutes. If you can please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to last night's city council meeting just very briefly. I was heartened by the decision of the city council last night in the 6-0 vote, not to just roll over to the city manager and pass a 3-year contract with the downtown streets team. We all agree they do wonderful work, but the pending allegations and the lack of willingness of the downtown streets team and Owen Bird to turn over the information needed to make a full decision as to whether or not there were sexual wrongdoings and whether the environment of the entire workforce there at the administrative office is a toxic one. Well, I'm just glad that you all decided that we're going to have further investigation, that we're not going to let this linger like the Zach Perone matter has been allowed to linger. I also wanted to make the comment that I think it's great that the city attorney, Molly Stump, is going to seek out all the pleadings in reference to the pending litigation or completed litigation around the downtown streets team scandal. But I am requesting that all the council members take a look at the actual pleadings themselves, so they're not just tied to Ms. Stump's interpretation or summary of what the pleadings say, so that ultimately when you make a decision as to whether or not there is a serious allegations, you will have read the actual pleadings and be able to give your own independent decision-making opinion as to whether or not we should go another 2 years with the same administrators when we look at this beginning in January of 2021. So again, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And if anyone else would like to speak on an item that is not on today's agenda, please raise your hand on the Zoom app or press *9. All right, I see no other hands raised.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our two speakers. Let's please move on to our first item, an update from the city's state and federal legislative advocates and a discussion on the 2021 legislative guidelines. Mr. DeLuca and Mr. Palmer, thank you for joining us tonight, you and your team. And I believe staff has a short presentation. Then we'll go to members of the public. Actually, maybe the presentation, then our advocates in Sacramento and DC, and then maybe members of the public and then council.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Heather Dollar. I would just echo what you said. We have 3 items on this portion of the agenda to review the legislative guidelines for next year and then to hear from our state and federal contract lobbyists. And with us today, we have Steve Palmer with Van Scoyoc Associates in DC and Nicolas DeLuca and Andres Ramirez with Townsend Public Affairs in Sacramento. So we can certainly take any of those 3 items and whatever order you prefer, Mr. Mayor. I might suggest, given the time difference, that we hear from Mr. Palmer in DC first.
Makes sense. Let's go with that.
Great. Then, Steve, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to get a little bit of a retrospective of what happened this year and maybe some thoughts about what might happen next year in DC.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Mayor and members of the committee. I think rubbing my eyes might have given me a little advantage over Nicola in terms of going first, but I do appreciate the indulgence of doing that. As Heather suggested, I want to give you a quick summary of kind of where we were in terms of our advocacy this past year for the city. And there are 3 things I want to touch on. The first is COVID, the second is police reform, and the third is the infrastructure bill that the House passed earlier this year. So the year obviously has been dominated by COVID. The Congress passed 3 bills in March, including the CARES Act, which was a $2.2 trillion bill. $150 billion of that went to state and large county and city direct financial assistance. Obviously, the city did not get that direct financial assistance. A little bit of direct funding from the CDBG formula funds that came through HUD, but so there wasn't a fair allocation in terms of how that money was distributed. And there's been an effort ever since then, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, to try to rectify that so that there is more of a direct financial flow of federal funds for COVID relief to cities like the size of Palo Alto and others. There have been several attempts. The House passed the CARES Act. They moved next to the HEROES Act in May. They passed a $3 trillion bill called the HEROES Act. The Senate started to get concerned. The Senate Republicans more concerned about fiscal conservatives took over, and there was an effort to try to move a bill that was $500 billion, with a large portion of that focused on school reopening and a number of other different initiatives. But it met with some strong resistance from some members of its own party, as well as Senate Democrats, and the bill did not move anywhere. So they've been at a standstill on COVID since June, the 1st of June. And we have to take into account the fact that this was a shortened year. I should have started by saying this is a shortened year legislatively because of the presidential elections, the nominating conventions in July and August, and then the focus on the general election and campaigning in the fall. So the legislative outlook for COVID, I'll come back to in a moment, but it's certainly been one that has dominated the legislative agenda for the year, and that's where our attention has been for much of the year as well for the city. In June, unfortunately, much of the attention was focused on policing reform. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was introduced in the House. It passed the House in June. Very strong support for the bill. It established a national database for excessive force encounters. limiting police protections, legal protections for police, and banning chokeholds. In response, the Senate introduced its own bill and for somewhat similar but much less strong. But it focused less on banning police activities and limiting their protections, and more on commissions to study what could be done and what should be done, and limiting chokeholds as opposed to banning them. The Senate did not pass its bill. The two are, it's unclear whether it never made any further progress after the House passed its bill in June. Negotiations continued on it, but then with the the presidential conventions, this legislation seemed to wither away. Infrastructure became a focus, and later in June and July, the Speaker introduced a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill that was really focused initially on the need for the reauthorization of surface transportation programs, highway transit and passenger rail programs. And the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee approved a $500 billion 5-year bill for surface transportation. And then the Democratic leadership added $1 trillion to that bill, and that was when it was brought to the House floor. And that included funding for broadband, for schools, housing, clean energy, for hospitals, water and wastewater. Unfortunately, the bill was drafted by the Democrats only without Republican input. It passed the House on a party line vote, and the Senate really took no action on that bill either. So in a nutshell, it was a short legislative year. A number of the different priorities of the city were considered this year, but unfortunately, very few of them were finally enacted into law. And I should say in the infrastructure bill, there was really heavy emphasis on rail grade separation projects and the need for more funding for those kinds of projects, which we were working with the committee on in terms of trying to make sure that they focus their efforts on that. So what lies ahead? Even though it's December 8th, and we're looking at the possibility of the Congress wrapping up its agenda in the next 10 days or so, there are a lot of open issues on the table that the lame duck Congress is trying to address. COVID relief continues to be an issue. If you look, the issue, the concern again is direct financial assistance. A group of 6 bipartisan senators came up with a proposal right after Thanksgiving that was for $908 billion. The House was ready to go to negotiate on anything, and the Speaker came forward and said she would support the bipartisan bill as well. And President Trump has said he'll sign any bill that comes to him. But the hangup has been, again, direct financial assistance to cities and counties and states. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been adamantly opposed to bailing out what he calls a bailout of local governments and state governments. And the concern, as always, is putting money into to bail out pension plans that the cities and counties and states have enacted. So as of today, as of this morning, it's so fluid. As of this morning, it appeared there was going to be an agreement with about $30 billion going to cities nationwide, and $30 billion going to counties nationwide, and then the remainder, about $60 billion, going to states. The deal seems to have fallen apart, though, because, again, Senator McConnell has said, let's set aside state and local funding. Let's set aside liability for businesses, which is a primary concern of his, and let's try to move a COVID relief bill that doesn't include those two things. So it is a possibility that may move before the Congress adjourns before Christmas, but it's not entirely clear. And I'm setting these up because the members of the committee, these are likely to be the issues that could be the agenda for Congress next year as well. Finally, the Congress also has to keep the government functioning, and they have not passed any of the appropriations bills, even though the fiscal year started on October 1st. The concern, they've essentially worked out the majority of the issues differences between the House and Senate on the funding bills. But again, the issues are border wall funding on the southern border, police reform funding for anti-racism training for police, and the sage grouse, which is an issue for several Western states. So there are environmental concerns, there are policing reform, and there are immigration issues that continue to hold up the final spending package for the Congress this year. So lastly, what lies ahead? Well, as I said, I was teeing up most of these issues because I think the majority of them will carry into the early part of next year. President-elect Biden has said infrastructure is going to be one of his priorities. He's told the House leadership he would like to have the infrastructure bill that passed the House, the $1.5 trillion bill, back on the House floor as early as February. That's possible, but again, there are two sticking points with that bill. And that is how to pay for it. There's not sufficient tax resources available in the Highway Trust Fund to pay for it. And then second of all, it's a very one-sided bill drafted by House Democrats, and the Senate Republicans are unlikely to take up the bill even if it does pass the House. So there will be a difficulty in terms of getting an agreement there. And again, that's the bill that we would look to try to increase funding for rail grade separation projects. COVID relief will continue to be an issue, funding for vaccines, trying to make sure the distribution systems are fully funded. And at this point, that's primarily the only two items for President-elect Biden's legislative agenda that he's really focused on. There's certainly a lot more to come, but I think it's going to be focused on COVID response, vaccine distribution, and then to the degree the infrastructure package is part of that. It's part of the getting people back to work and having the economy recover as quickly as possible. I will say lastly, and I'll turn it back for any questions you might have. There is this very strong possibilities that in the House, congressional earmarks may return. There appears to be a very strong interest among the incoming chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House, the chair of the Transportation Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Both have said that they will have earmarks as a part of their bills this year. The Senate has been silent on it, so it's not clear how they'll be treated by senators and if the earmarks will survive in the final legislative package at the end of next year. But that's something that we've talked with staff about, we're focused on, and we're trying to make sure we get the best information to you in terms of what kind of criteria they'll be looking at. The one big thing that we do know is the earmarks will be focused on cities, counties, public agencies, as opposed to any kind of private corporations or private entities. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back and answer any questions, and hopefully can give you some more information through those questions.
Thanks, Mr. Palmer. Ms. Dollar, do we want to go to Mr. DeLuca next, or?
Whatever you would like, Mr. Chair. We could take the questions on the federal side now if you want, before we turn it over to state.
Okay, let's go for that. Councilmember Koo and Phil Sith. I see Councilmember Koo's hand.
Yes, thank you. Since the time difference also, and what Mr. Palmer said is fresh on mind, the infrastructure build at the 1.5 trillion, and I know that that's a means for us to get grade separation funds. I wonder if there's a possibility of including perhaps broadband in there, whether we can get financing for that also, since COVID and it's evident that broadband will be helpful.
Absolutely, Council Member. It is a priority of both the House and President Biden. The Senate has been, I'm sure, will support increased investment in broadband, particularly rural broadband, because there are so many states that need it. I do think it's going to be included in the infrastructure bill. I don't know how it would affect the city yet, because they never really got down to that level of detail. But there is a increased focus on broadband because of COVID and the need for, to help people work from home in this environment. So it is going to be something that we will continue to advocate for and try to bring back more information on how that money would be allocated.
Oh, thank you so much. And then you mentioned something, congressional earmarks. I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to apologize at all. It's something that Congress banned 10 years ago in 2010. So prior to that, it has been a longstanding tradition that members of Congress could actually take discretionary funds and designate them for projects that they thought were most important for their congressional districts or states. So for example, let's take a grade separation project. If I was representing the city, let's take Congresswoman Eshoo, and typically we would work with the Congress, the delegation from Palo Alto, give them projects that we think are meritorious that they could hopefully could support, and take them to the Congresswoman and the two senators and ask for their help in seeking directed funding for those projects. It's never enough to complete a whole project. The earmarks are always small. They're focused, but it's a way for Congress to actually focus some of the federal funding on projects that those members of Congress think are most important. The way it's done right now is federal agencies have that discretion, those discretionary accounts, and they make grant awards based on what the Department of Transportation or Department of Justice feels is the most meritorious version of a grant application. But it's a way, earmarks are a way that Congress can actually involve themselves in directing the funding.
And lastly, sorry. Lastly, there is, last year there was a lot of talk about opportunity zones. Where is that going now?
So the Trump administration really has made a priority, opportunity zones a priority, and they've really tried to channel most, again, competitive grants. The grant applications are really encouraged to focus on opportunity zones and how they can leverage federal funds to enhance opportunity zones. It's unclear to me anyway where the Biden administration will go with respect to this initiative and these programs. The Senate will continue to make it a priority because Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina is a Republican, and he was the champion of opportunity zones initially. But I just don't know where the Biden administration is going to be on it, but it will continue to be a priority within Congress.
And they still have the federal funds allocated for it? I mean, is there actually federal funds to provide the grants?
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you if I interrupted you. No, there's no federal money for grants for opportunity zones. It's a tax incentive-based program, so that if a city and a state designate an opportunity zone, and it's a means to attract private investment into that area, and then the investors are given a tax break as a result of that investment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember. Councilmember Philseth.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. This is obviously interesting stuff to watch. Is it the case that actually it's kind of useless to speculate right now because so much of it swings on the Georgia runoff, and what we really ought to do is save our questions and ask you in a month? And
I'd be happy to come back after January 5th. There is, I'm going to answer your question as a yes, but for two reasons. One of them is the Georgia runoff, but also two, after President-elect Biden is sworn in and has had a little bit more time to articulate what his priorities are going to be, his legislative priorities, whether we really do have earmarks and things like that. I think there's a lot more certainty that we'll know, that we'll be able to talk about, I think, by, say, mid to late January.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
And Councilmember, I don't want to discourage your questions. I wasn't trying to punt it in any way, but I think you hit it right on the head.
Thanks. Just one quick one. There's been a lot of talk, and you mentioned, state and local government funding. What is that actually? What are kind of the parameters of that? Would it be allowed to fund salaries, infrastructure, operations? Is there any more detail there?
It's being, they came out with this proposal, this $908 billion proposal right after Thanksgiving, and they issued a one-page summary of it. And I was on a phone with the Conference of Mayors the other day, and they were actually involved in trying to help the congressional offices draft the legislation, the language that would go with that. So they just have basically principles right now. But Mayor, the way they are describing it was that it would be allocated through formulas based on lost revenue, 2/3 of lost revenue, 1/3 on population. So I'm sorry to make that a little more clear. Of that $30 billion I mentioned, it would be allocated 1/3 based on population across the country, and then 2/3 based on lost revenue. There would be some guardrails on it, and it would be, you couldn't use it for pension liabilities, and it would have to be focused on COVID, but that obviously can be defined in a number of different ways.
Okay, thank you. That may be helpful going forward. Anything else from my colleagues or staff before moving on to Mr. DeLuca? Councilmember Koo, are you?
I was just saying thank you, and thank you to Mr. Palmer for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you to your team.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, Mr. DeLuca, do you want to take us away? I know we just had a whole new group sworn in, I believe yesterday, and so things must be afoot.
Absolutely. So Mayor and committee members, Nicolo DeLuca from Townsend Public Affairs. With me this evening is my coworker, Andres Ramirez. We're here to talk about the 2020 session. And then so far we're into day one of the 2021 session. That's already been a barn burner. So I'm going to be the bad news person, and then Andres gets to talk about the good news. So 2020 was starting off great. We had a great advocacy day. Councilmember Filseth was with us, and the city manager and others. We're upbeat, we're excited, we're advocating for state funding for grade separation, something that Senator Hill was very helpful with, and Assemblymember Berman the year before. There's surplus, everything's great. And then COVID comes. So obviously the wheels fell off. We all know that, but it's going to have a massive effect on this session for many different reasons. One of them is, so even though last year was the second year of a 2-year session, all of those bills that, remember that dreaded last week of session, and that we'll get into a little bit more, all those bills that went nowhere are going to be reintroduced for this session, in addition to all the other bills that will be coming. So last year, only about 428 bills landed on the governor's desk. In a typical year, we've got about 1,200 to 1,500 bills on the governor's desk. So we're expecting a massive deluge of legislation. Just yesterday alone, just for the beginning of the 21 session, we've already had 168 bills introduced. So not for you to worry about, that's for us to worry about. That's why you have us, but it's going to be quite exciting. And so the 2020 session ended, it was embarrassing, frankly. A lot of times we're used to sort of that rancor, no offense to kind of the federal side where things get so politicized, but this last year, that last week, we had the Assembly fighting the Senate. We had members in the Senate fighting each other. We had the Assembly Democrats fighting. And so a lot of bills, and Councilmember Koo, I know a lot of them are bills you watch closely. A lot of those housing bills, frankly, just ran out of time. They weren't able to be heard. A lot of the police reform, public safety reform bills, 2 or 3 got to the governor, but some of the more controversial ones didn't even get heard. So those are going to be coming back, and we're already expecting that. Housing, we know that a lot of those bills that actually were had some good amendments and give a lot of local control, those were put on hold, those are coming back. And even issues such as climate control and wildfire legislation, that will be coming back. So not a lot of action, because remember, I'm the bad news person. So on my side, not a lot of action, but I'm going to quickly tag team to Andres to talk about some of the good news and some of the good things that we worked on the city's behalf. And then after that, I'll touch a little bit more about what we're going to be seeing in 2021.
Yeah, thank you, Nicolo, and pleasure to be with you, Mayor and committee members. So, as Nicolo said, I will be more of the good news bearer. This year, through the federal CARES Act coming down through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the state obviously got a lot of money trickling down from the federal level. With that, we worked closely with Senator Hill, Assemblymember Berman, and we're in discussions with the governor's administration in getting direct allocations to municipalities. So through those efforts, writing letters on behalf of the city, delivering those, and continuing stakeholder conversations, Palo Alto was able to get an $854,000 direct allocation through the state's portion of that CARES Act. In addition to that, on the legislative side, we had Senate Bill 793, which was Senator Hill's banning of flavored tobacco legislation. That ended up going through, and on behalf of the city, we worked on that with writing letters, testifying in health committee hearings, and just participating in those stakeholder conversations throughout the entire process. So that was, if you will, Senator Hill's, goodbye legislation, his final big push to ban flavored tobacco statewide, and that was ultimately signed by the governor immediately. And with that, I will toss it back over to Nicolo to discuss a little bit about what's going to come up in 2021.
So for 2021, as the mayor said yesterday, new members were sworn in, and then the legislature adjourned, and then they will re-adjourn on January 4th. That will kick off the 21-22 two-year legislative session. It's already out of the gate. The topics are going to be COVID recovery. Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins has already said that's one of her top priorities. So COVID recovery, think of that as small business support. Obviously, a lot's going on. You all know it locally with the restaurants, hair salons, and others being shuttered. So there's gonna be a big push there. Housing, again, continue to see efforts on increasing the ability for housing to be built. And then separate from housing, but somewhat related, homelessness, that's gonna be another big push. We're already hearing about the big city mayors will be making another push to help get cities and counties direct allocation. Public safety related, that's also what we're just kind of be calling the public safety reform, reimagining policing. That's going to be coming back. And then wildfire and climate resiliency is going to be coming. So yesterday, first day, 164 bills were introduced. Of note, Assemblymember David Chu has legislation, it's AB 16. It's to extend the eviction moratorium. As you recall, that's going to expire February of next year. So he's got his legislation out there. Right now, it's only a 3-page bill. There'll be a lot of negotiations and a lot of work being done to extend the eviction moratorium. And then we've seen some policing bills coming out. And then ultimately, some of the housing bills, they've already put their marker down. The climate bond, which you might recall, that has been reintroduced. I think there's going to be some great opportunities for the city, working closely with the city to make sure the pots of funds that we care about will be beefed up. And more importantly, some of the eligibility requirements, we will be working on those to make sure not only that the city benefits, but some of the entities and organizations you all work with will benefit too. So with that, I am happy to take any questions. Just expect a lot. We're going to have a heck of a lot of bills coming from everyone that we've spoken with. The lockdown from last year, as you recall, we would call in during committee hearings, and that was an absolute zoo. I know Ms. Dollar, she's seen some of those committee hearings. Those committee hearings ran for so long just due to just technology glitches. So we've been told that from now through probably at least June 30th, it'll be the same restrictions. Only one member can be in the Capitol with only one staffer. Advocates cannot go in. So fortunately, we've got 20 plus years of relationships that we can count on to testify. You could either do it via video or to call in. And then even so, we're assuming the vaccine gets out quickly, which is another issue the state wants to work on. So even if the vaccine gets out quickly, there'll still be limited capacity going into the building to make sure there's no flare-ups. So anyway, like I said, I'm bad news. Andres is good news. So we're optimistic about 21 and happy to take any questions you all have.
Thank you both, much appreciated. Council members Filseth or Koo, just hit your hands or speak up. Councilmember Filseth.
Thanks, folks. Hi, Nicola. Nice to see you again. Hi, Andres.
Great seeing you.
So what does the timeline for all this look like? I mean, what are the big milestones that we ought to be looking at?
Great question. So they come back on the 4th so they could start reintroducing bills. The end of February is technically the bill introduction deadline. We say technically because I think we all know there's different ways to get around that. But by the end of February, we'll see probably around, I'm just going to estimate about 2,400 bills. There has not been any hard caps, but there have been discussions, especially in the Assembly, about limiting to how many bills can get over to the Senate. There's different ways to do it, but they are being cognitive of how many get over to the Senate. And then we start kind of thinning the herd. The end of May is always the big first House deadline. And then the end of July is usually the second House deadline. So the big milestones, January 4th, they're back, more bills are coming. End of February is technically the bill introduction deadline. And then end of May, we're gonna do the appropriations deadline, and then end of June. just to make matters more fun, because Councilmember, I know you like all the intricacies, Governor is going to introduce his budget. I think it's the third week of January. We've seen this in years past. The Brown administration, respectfully, they're the masters of it, kind of merging policy and budget into one. So then the governor is going to do his budget second, third week of January. Of course, the May revise got to get adopted by June 12th. We expect some policy items to be interwoven into that. So that's an additional deadline.
So given that all this is going to be done under, pandemic rules and in and out and limitations and so forth, 2,400 bills feels like a lot. I mean, so if they aren't going to get through that many, how soon are we going to know?
We'll know by June. We'll have a better understanding by June. And then something that we like to do, and we were speaking with Chantal and Heather about this, a lot of what we like to do is when we speak to offices, we kind of get the real dirt. Like, hey, we see all these bills you have. How many are you really advancing? On behalf of the city of Palo Alto, we want to know what should we be working on your overall bill package. So that way, even though they kind of have the using the vehicle to move forward, we at least know what's really an effort, what's really being pushed, and what they like to call a 2-year bill, which is something that they advance a little bit and then wait till next year.
Right. And I think you said the deadline to pass appropriations was end of May.
Yeah, traditionally it's right before the Memorial Day holiday, like that Thursday and Friday.
Got it. Cool.
I'm also going to throw in another fun wrinkle is this whole Senator Kamala Harris's seat. There's so many rumors about who gets appointed, which has so many different dominoes. Hypothetically, say the governor appoints, Secretary Padilla, then who fills that seat, and then whoever's filling that seat, did they open up an assembly seat or a Senate seat? So, I mean, the parlor games are definitely afoot already.
I nominate Lydia.
There you go.
All right, thanks very much, folks.
My pleasure, our pleasure.
Thanks, Councilmember. Councilmember Koo, do you have questions here?
Thank you. So I don't see anything on transportation here.
We haven't seen anything quite yet. Are you talking about for 21?
Yes.
But that's yesterday was really the first day to introduce bills. Not to steal his thunder, but Andres is in close communication with the Senate Transportation Committee and the Assembly Transportation Committee to see what's going on. Another thing is kind of hot off the press. We're hearing rumors about a lot of committee chairs changing. We're hearing that the Assembly Transportation Committee chair could change. As we all know, Senator Bell, who we all love, he was the chair of Senate Transportation. He's termed out. Who's going to be appointed there? So as much as a lot of bills were introduced yesterday, we're still waiting to see who fills some very, very important policy committee heads. And then that impacts what staff stays on and then kind of what the tone and tenor. However, transportation and infrastructure are definitely big issues for 21.
Obviously, telecommuting would be something that would be looking for. I know there was that 60% introduced by MTC, and it came across a lot of barriers, but it's certainly something that we want to look at too. The other thing is, I was going to ask if it would be possible for you to provide us, once the committees are set and who is going to be where, if we might be able to get a list of those, including their contact phone numbers and email addresses and so forth.
Happily.
Thank you.
And then we'll also put it into who they are and the relationships that we have, why that's important, what we could advance for the city, but no, absolutely.
Yeah, and we would appreciate any kind of advice or guidance you have in terms of the committees and what you just said also. So that would be extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeLuca and Mr. Ramirez. Just one quick question. How do you expect the tenor of the conversation on the bills to change, particularly around the housing issues? I know some people might say the last year or two have been a bit of a dud. And so what are some of our legislators looking at in the next year or two?
So the good news is as tone and tenor, there's a fresh crop of new legislators, and that's always helpful. The break definitely came at the right time. I know just from the Senate contacts we've talked to, no one was happy about how that went down. And frankly, they're, their words, embarrassed. I just saw that some of the text of an interview from the pro tem. She's wants to put housing out there again. She's committed to doing housing legislation. Senator Wiener reintroduced his bill about 10 units, up to 10 units, and allowing cities to make that decision if this is something that they want to do. So I think the local argument, they've heard it loud and clear. I think with the pro tem getting more involved in housing, she's got, a good understanding of what it needs to move forward. And I know that the assembly is always, open and optimistic about some of the housing bills, but also keep in mind what changes are needed, how to help protect the locals. So Mayor, to answer your question directly, housing will come back. I think there's going to be more of a collaborative approach. And we've already seen it with what's been introduced yesterday. And there's also a proposal to do a homeless bond, affordable housing and homeless bond. So I think it's been clear funding is needed, some type of streamlining is desired, and then there's many different constituencies to work with to help make sure that everyone either has their issues addressed or they're as comfortable with the legislation as possible.
Okay. Nice to hear, especially about the potential homeless bond.
Absolutely.
Councilmember Phil Seth.
Actually, thanks for letting me back in. I wanted to ask that, you think there's actually going to be money? I mean, actual money for affordable housing this year? I mean, as opposed to just, zoning stuff, right?
So we
But
have
they
a
actually might invest-
one-time surplus.
Sorry?
There's this one-time surplus
Yeah.
that, no one really saw coming. Kind of
Yeah,
fell from
20
the sky.
billion or something, huh?
Yeah, so I think that's going to be spread out. Obviously, COVID relief, small business relief.
Right.
In years past, homelessness has gotten a set aside. I think for the affordable housing, I think significant funding will come from a bond measure. And I think like in years past, they're going to want to merge the different bonds. I think they'll start out as one might be housing, one might be homeless. At the end of the day, they merge them together, maybe even throw some transportation because they're all interlinked. But for the real funding, for affordable housing, I see it as a bond. For the quick fix and to address immediate issues like homelessness, I see that coming out of the surplus.
Interesting. A bond will have to go to voters.
Correct, and it would be 22 the earliest. But yeah,
22.
absolutely to the voters.
Okay, so the next couple of years, we're looking at, basically the surplus.
Exactly.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Koo.
I was going to ask, so it's interesting, I mean, what you just said, so the housing bond, and then you mentioned about merging existing.
Well, so if you recall, last year, there was the faster proposal, which Andres worked very closely on. And there was a big discussion of, well, if you're just doing transportation, you're just really transporting, workers. What about the housing? Well, if you're doing the housing, we need more funding for the housing. So that discussion got really, really loud, but then got put on hold because of COVID. But and there's a lot of behind the scenes discussion of, if you're doing a transportation bond, you've got to include housing. Don't have them compete against each other. Don't have them too close and kind of take away, the focus or the resource, have them be brought together as one. So that's what we would see for a path for success. That's what we see happening.
I see. Now on the homelessness, how would that bond be kept separate? I mean, so a better question is, do you see redevelopment agencies coming back?
I don't.
Or reintroduced?
There's been so many efforts to either do RDA 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever you want to say, and they've never been successful. And then there's been a discussion, and they've tried to kind of redo redevelopment as like sustainable communities. I just don't see it. And then I just think due to getting out of the slump that we're in now for COVID, I don't see anything redevelopment related being successful in 21.
One more. You said David Chu is bringing a bill to extend evictions moratorium, AB 16. So the extension of the eviction moratorium, how will it address funding to the landlord? Or, I mean, where will the funding, landlords are also having issues, right?
Correct.
And that really doesn't help them pay their bills either. is there discussion in there in terms of funding for landlords or for property owners so that
Absolutely.
they can continue to let the rents, forgive the rents, or, you know?
Absolutely. That is part of it. So right now it's just a framework. It's not, the meat's not there, but it's clear the intent language and the verbiage is clear about helping out small property owners, mom and pop property owners, having a pool of funding for tenants to help do rental relief, and then making sure that the eviction gets extended. So right now, obviously the devil's in the detail, but it's clear, and just from speaking to the assembly member and his office, rental relief, help the small help the small property owners, and then extending the eviction deadline.
Okay, because, you know, how do you say, deferring the rent payments does not help the tenants because they're going to have to come up with a big chunk of money in order, even if it is, how do you say, parsed out in time, it's still going to be a big issue for them to come up with extra money when they're already in difficulties. So that is something that needs to be considered in the bill as well. Thank you.
Yes, and if you don't mind my chiming in, so just to piggyback on what Nicolo discussed with last year's bill, AB 3088 from Assemblymember Chu, that was under tight time constraints. So although both tenant advocacy groups and landlord representation groups were involved in the conversation, the ultimate decision at the last second was that the state would not be able to afford evicting a mass amount of people during the height of the pandemic. So as this bill essentially extension of the moratorium bill is introduced, there's a much larger time frame. Well, I shouldn't say much larger, but there is a larger time frame to hash out those discussions. And I know from conversations from other stakeholders that the landlord advocacy groups are heavily involved in these conversations. So there, in essence, there will be much more of a negotiative process for coming to a final bill in this session.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very reassuring. Obviously, the anxiety, you know, taking time, but it has to take the time. And since Mr. Palmer is still here, I was wondering, there is no danger of losing CDBG, right?
No, it's Councilmember, I'm sorry, there is none. It's been strongly supported by both parties in the Congress.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Councilmember Phil Smith.
Just briefly, Mr. Palmer, we didn't ask you about the FAA, and I assume there's a lot more stuff going on this year than that, but we'll be back sooner or later.
And Councilmember, you did ask a question, but let me just say too, we've sort of been in a lull with Washington and Congress anyway in terms of the FAA because they've done their multi-year reauthorization, but hearings are going to start up again next year. Noise continues to be a concern even in some communities with the reduced air traffic. So right. We'll definitely be engaged on that again as that the economy picks up and air traffic picks up.
Super, thank you.
Okay, thanks to everyone there and to my colleagues. Let's maybe go to our members of the public and then come back to council. And I'll just remind us, we are also tonight looking at adopting the 21 federal and state legislative guidelines.
All right, so if you'd like to speak on this item, please raise your hand on the Zoom app or press *9. It seems we have already 2 speakers who have raised their hands. There's a Rebecca Eisenberg. I'll allow you to speak. If you can unmute yourself, you'll have 2 minutes on the timer.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hopefully this time my internet won't drop on me. Oh, but it tells me it's unstable. I have 2 teenagers in school and they take up a lot of bandwidth. Okay, so the major point I want to make right now is that there seems to be a misunderstanding or misconception about what the state has done this year. I guess I would like to bring this to the 3 speakers that just spoke now. There's been a lot of conversation that you're hopeful that the state will offer up money to alleviate homelessness. Well, how can you not be aware that the state of California actually, via the California Department of Housing and Community Development, gave away almost $1 billion in 2020 to alleviate homelessness and also to build affordable housing. Mountain View received 12.3 million. Santa Clara County received, I don't remember the exact numbers, maybe 30 million. San Francisco close to 50 million. Fresno, Bakersfield, San Bernardino, and numerous dozens of other cities received tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars free from the state through federally funded, through a federally funded program to give free money without much restriction other than the fact that the housing and the temporary shelter had to be done by the end of the year if cities applied. And Palo Alto, unlike our neighbors, did not apply for this free money from the state. So when I asked around, I was told that the reason Palo Alto City Council didn't apply for this free money is because Palo Alto City Council didn't want the free money. And so, this money has helped Mountain View provide a shelter bed for every single homeless person in Mountain View, while we in Palo Alto have 0 beds for the homeless. So I know I'm running out of time, but just please tell me whose idea this was not to apply for this free money. And maybe can you be more proactive in telling and encouraging our city council to apply for money that's free for us, and especially given that the state of California gave away $1 billion this past year and we didn't even ask for it. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Aaron James. I've allowed you to speak. You'll have 2 minutes on the timer if you can unmute.
Good evening, Mr. DeLuca and Mr. Ramirez. If I'd have had a chance to ask you questions, my first question would have been about AB 3121, the first in the nation reparations commission that's going to be now has been passed on September 30th. And I watched the signing celebration on Zoom back on September 30th. I'd like to know what you think is going to be the applicability of the Reparations Commission and the Act to local government. Can we form our own? I would hope so. Secondly, I would have liked to have asked you about the California Racial Justice Act, AB 2542. We have a big scandal ongoing regarding a police officer, a Captain Zach Perona in the city of Palo Alto. And for the last year, I've been trying to get the truth from the city council regarding, and the city, allegations that he used racially loaded words. He's a white officer against a black officer who was then essentially run out of the city. I think the Racial Justice Act, and Ash Cholera was the lead legislator in that regard, gives us a wide opportunity to go after officers like Perone now. And I would have loved to have heard your impression about that. Not only do we have the scandal that I mentioned earlier, the Downtown Streets team unresolved, involving 2 privileged white individuals, but Zach Perone happens to be an upper class white privileged man. And it seems there's a habit and pattern in Palo Alto of covering up out of white privilege and white supremacy. And what are we going to do about that on a state level? Because Palo Alto is not the only city afflicted with that kind of problem. I would have also wanted to ask you about whether the Decertification Act regarding decertifying bad cops is going to be brought back up again legislatively. So those are some of the things that I would really like to have heard from you and my representatives ask you about. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And our next speaker is Chuck Jagoda. You'll have 2 minutes to speak. If you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I also would like to speak about the Downtown Streets team. I'm very prejudiced in favor of the Downtown Streets team. I was a member and I found it very helpful. The people were very good and did a great job. A lot of helping service organizations really aren't. And they're sometimes even mean to homeless people, but the Downtown Streets team was great. I know the people involved in the controversies that I've seen in the paper, they're all good, great people as far as I'm concerned. It's tragic that all this trouble exists. But as somebody who loves the downtown streets team and the people involved, I really think the best thing would be to not keep Owen Bird's report secret, but to publicize it.
Mr. Jagoda, this agenda item is about an update on the city, state, and federal legislative advocates and our recommendations for guidelines for 21. If you could keep your comments focused on that, please.
All right. Well, here's a suggestion about the police. I think that it's very expensive for Palo Alto, other cities, to pay the tremendous amounts of money that they end up paying in many of these cases. And I think that, again, as somebody who supports the police, my father was a policeman, I think it would be much better to give some love to the police and provide mental health for police. Some of the things they've done are not the acts of stable, balanced people. They're horrible attacks, totally unnecessary, totally benefiting no one. Please help the police to do their job. And oh, one more thing, they should self-indemnify. A policeman, when hired, should take out an insurance policy to pay for any of the results of his actions, instead of those tremendous burdens be visited on people who have no responsibility or no power in the situation. The policeman had the power, he should pay the bill. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, if you have any other comments on this agenda item, please raise your hand on the Zoom app or press *9. And here we have no other raised hands.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to our three speakers. Just channeling what one of our members asked, Mr. DeLuca, any updates on, I think, 2542 and 3121?
I don't know about those two, but I'll definitely tell you the recertification bill is going to be reintroduced in some form or fashion. We've spoken with Senator Bradford about that. I know he's got every intention in doing something. And in addition, it was in October, the Speaker's office put together a select committee of Assembly members to talk about some of the police reform issues and what have you. So to the Speaker, sorry, I couldn't answer your first two questions, but as it relates to decertification, we expect to see that bill come back.
Okay, thank you so much. Councilmember Filseth.
Move to recommend the City Council approve the 2021 federal and state legislative guidelines.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I will second that. You want to speak to your motion?
I think they're appropriate, and I think there's enough unknowns that there's not a lot of value added in tweaking them right now.
Totally agreed. I think staff did a nice job. If you read through the red lines, it focuses them a bit and also corrects for a few gaps we've had in the past.
Great.
Anybody else want to speak to this? Councilmember Koo?
Actually, you know, with so much changes in the at state in terms of the number of legislations that's coming through, I would find it more prudent that we have more frequent updates and pros and cons presented to council rather than what we had experienced the years before. I think that there's way too many changes for me to be willing to accept this legislative guidelines. I don't have so much problem with the federal, but definitely with the state, with the amount of legislation and how they're with the COVID guidelines in terms of advocacy. I think we need more frequent, updates and also recommendations, and also council guidance in terms of writing letters and also looking at legislation and how to improve it, not so much to oppose outright, but if we can support and amend, if amended, so we have an opportunity of being a part of amending the bill, then I think that it should be coming to council more often than just tracking and monitoring and then bringing it to us at the very last moment for us to kind of like have really nothing much to say. Or to recommend or to send back to the state. So I do think that there needs to be some review of what we have now here in front of us. So I won't support the motion.
Okay. But not hearing an alternative or substitute, I think I'm going to call the vote if that's okay. Okay. Councilmember Philseth?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Councilmember Koo?
No.
Okay, that passes on a 2-to-1 vote with
Quick
Councilmember.
procedural question. Given that it did not pass unanimously, that means it does not go on consent. Is that right?
I am not sure of the exact protocols from PNS. I think that's been generally our practice in pre-council. At least that's what you and I follow typically.
Okay.
So
Okay. That
it'll
sounds
go to
good. Thanks.
council. Yeah. Cool. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. DeLuca, Mr. Palmer, Mr. Ramirez. We really appreciate your engagement and attendance here tonight.
Our pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on to item number 2, the Policy and Services Committee discussion and recommendations for the 21 City Council priority setting process. Any presentation from staff on this one?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Fine. Just a brief introduction, letting you and attendees know that in addition to the staff report, there was an App Places memo which provided the list of topic suggestions from the City Council members. And then also on the agenda was a link for public comment, which included the content of the 2 submissions that came in writing and other council feedback was given verbally. And then just a reminder, as you go through your discussion, of course, at the annual retreat for council, priority setting is a major component of that date. We will go back to council members who may have missed an opportunity, as well as provide community feedback that we are gathering or will be gathering later this month and early through January. So there will be more opportunities for people to weigh in, as well as attending the retreat itself and providing feedback to the council. So wanted to make sure that you were all aware that there are still ways to have input into this process. But tonight we hope that you will perhaps fine tune some recommendations or provide additional direction to staff. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to members of the public who may wish to speak on this item, please.
Yes, we have one raised hand. Aaron James, you'll have 2 minutes to speak on this item. I have allowed you to speak. If you can unmute yourself.
By the way, I remember going to a retreat, city council retreat at Foothills Park many, many years ago. I think Liz Nuss was there. I wish we could do that again. In any event, my priorities for in 2020 were, guess what? And I've been at it all year long, trying to get the city council and the city to release the Perone, the Captain Zach Perone investigation. Now that's going to be my #1 priority in 2021. And I do believe the Racial Justice Act is going to give me a hook in that regard. My second priority now will be, of course, making sure we bring to a completion the investigation of the downtown streets team to see whether or not privileged white administrators should remain in that position or, to the contrary, be fired to open those positions to other people. I don't know. We don't know the facts yet to make that conclusion, but I'm going to push those hard with the council. I'm also going to push hard for us to have a principled discussion about whether the city of Palo Alto needs tasers at the great expense that they cost. The independent police auditor's more recent report says in the 12 years we've had them, and this is a good statistic, we've only used them 31 times. That's about 2.5 times per year, but that's at a great expense to have those weapons. So we need to really just have a conversation and see what people think. It's very difficult for somebody that is labeled so-called, a police activist or somebody that wants best police practices to get something on the agenda. So maybe in 2021, I would ask you to to allow some of the folks that often have dissenting opinions on views, get a few items on the agenda. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So I'm going to push that a little bit more openness to contrary views other than mainstream stuff. And let's also see if we can do a little bit better with our city manager. Did you hear him last night? He talks in a circular manner. It's city manager talk. Often he's talking around issues. And please, please, City Council, don't roll over to Ed Chagota the way you did in 2020, in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Rebecca Eisenberg. I have allowed you to speak. If you can mute yourself.
Thank you. So I gotta say, I'm kind of confused. I just pointed out that the state has given away almost $1 billion of funding made available through the CARES Act, and the state made it available under a program called, and please committee, write this down, the Home Key program, Home Key, HOMEKEY program. It has provided hundreds of millions of dollars to other cities and even to Santa Clara County for the purpose of affordable housing and to alleviate homelessness. You can look at the website at the California Department of Housing and Development. You can Google Home Key program and you will see it. I asked this question and nobody followed up, and your paid lobbyists, paid with my taxpayer money, didn't respond to my question of whether they had recommended that our city not apply for this free money. As I mentioned, Mountain View now has shelter beds to serve every
Are you full?
single, hello, every single one, Lydia, you're not muted, every single one of their homeless population. But Palo Alto has 0 shelter beds. So those of you who have stated an interest in helping with homelessness, why are you not applying for the free money available from the state of California, the free money that does exist, that was given away? Do you really care about homelessness? Do you really want to provide housing for the lowest income? I hope the answer is yes. So please follow up about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Chuck Jagoda. You'll have 2 minutes. If you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to speak on both of the topics that have been brought up. The police, when I was homeless, I used to be around Happy Donuts. That was my home. I slept in my car, but hung out at Happy Donuts. And there are 2 fairly recent tragedies at the hands of police. One at Happy Donuts, a man was smashed to the cement and beaten and hurt for no apparent reason. His story, the policeman's story, didn't agree with the surveillance videotape. Very different stories. And then the other one was in Buena Vista trailer park right nearby, where another policeman beat a man and smashed his face on the hood of a car. Both of these were very expensive. I really don't see how that's sustainable. I mean, I know Palo Alto is wealthy, but that's a real waste. And about the issue of Palo Alto has homeless, no homeless shelters, as Ms. Eisenberg just said. It's worse than that. When I first came here about 10 years ago, there was a place called Clare Mateo on the border of Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. It was a woman's shelter, and it had fallen into disrepair and needed to be rehabbed and was closed 10 years ago, or maybe 8 years ago. But I don't know what's happened to it since, but nobody's done anything like get it back up and running. And there is shelter in Palo Alto, Heart and Home, headquartered at University Lutheran Church. started by Stanford students and still continues. But Palo Alto has lost shelter beds in the time I've been here, even with the addition of that of the program, the Heart and Home. Lost shelter beds. Wasting free money is like states that didn't take money for the ACA and didn't cover their citizens. This is unexplainable, indefensible, stupid. Thank you.
All right, thank you. If any other members of the public would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand on the Zoom app or press *9. And Mayor Fine, I see no other raised hands.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to our three speakers. Returning to council, item number 2. Our mandate here is discuss and consider making recommendations regarding 2020 priorities and potentially format and facilitation for the council's annual retreat coming up in January. Councilmember Filseth.
Yeah, so I thought that, these tend not to change radically from year to year. And so, between I was struck that between the last couple of years of these and the memo, the Ad Places memo tonight with a number of topics on it, some fairly broad, right? That seemed to me like it covered most of the territory that, we would want to consider, right? The one thing I would say is that, the whole COVID thing is probably going to dominate it, right? And, or be a major, major factor. And there are multiple aspects to that. There's going to be a public health element of that. There's going to be what's the impact on businesses and services as we go forward, both sort of the way we are today and as the vaccine hopefully appears and people start to get build up immunity to it. And then there's going to be, the city financial component of it's going to continue to be a major factor for this year and next year and so forth. And that all sort of gets, one line COVID-19 recovery, right? But be that as it may, I thought this was a fairly broad, comprehensive list of the kind of stuff the council is going to want to consider in January. That was my 2 bits.
Just jumping in, generally align myself with your comments, Councilmember Filseth. Thanks, staff, for kind of laying out the impetus for priorities and where they come from, what we do each year. I guess just commenting a little bit on what was suggested by next year's council members. Look, clearly housing, climate change, COVID-19 recovery, although I guess I'll point out it may not be recovery as soon as we want it to be, and we may still be dealing with ongoing new things. Yes, fingers crossed it's not that way. Even last night, we just had our first discussion about, hey, what does vaccine distribution look like? And so I would caution, next year's council that it may not be recovery as soon as we want it to be. Economic recovery is certainly part of that, but still dealing with the public health crisis and the economic fallout is going to be part of it. I guess there's only one mention of social justice, which I guess touches a little bit of economic justice, some of the police reforms we've been looking at. Maybe that's a little woven into some of the housing stuff. And then I'll note, maybe for the first time in a long time, it seems like transportation has fallen off somewhat in favor. I guess that's a lot because of the economic impacts of COVID. I will mention, a few months ago, I had a former mayor mention to me that I get to crow that I'm one of the few council members or mayors who solved the transportation and parking challenges in Palo Alto.
Thank you, Mayor Fine.
Yeah, certainly not my doing and not my wish. Absolutely not.
You picked an interesting way to do it.
Yeah. So anyways, I thought all of these were fine. Don't really see any issue with it, and appreciate staff's framing of the issue. Councilmember Koo.
Thank you for bringing up transportation, because that was what I was going to talk about. That even though we've seen a huge reduction in traffic, it's creeping back now. We should still focus on ensuring that we do address TDMs and TMAs and put guidelines in place or regulations in place so that hopefully they don't come back, right? And that we have telecommuting as one of our transportation objectives as well. And so we would have these guidelines in place. So it's never too soon to start looking at that and preparing. But otherwise, I mean, I think most of those are fine. And like I said, and like Councilmember Philsef said, I do see COVID recovery and the economic recovery as some of the more higher priority items. So I don't have a, oh, you know, did we used to kind of go with which council members or council elects had what types of priorities? And I was just wondering, I see the members elect have also submitted their opinions, right? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
And if I could interject, I did notice that in the recommendation of the report, I inadvertently just stuck with 2020 as priorities. Maybe I'm hoping we can do it again, but it should read 2021.
Okay, thanks for that. I know we're requested to make a recommendation. I don't really see any point doing that. Like, I think, you know, next year in January or February, you all are going to look at this list of 10 things and choose your top 3 or 4. I would just suggest it's pretty clear. It's, you know, housing, climate change, and COVID-19, maybe with half of a focus on something else. If my colleagues want to make any motions, though, of course, you are welcome. Councilmember Philseth.
Move that we refer the At Places memo to council for consideration in 2021 priority setting.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to speak to that?
No.
Councilmember Koo? Okay. Let's please vote. Councilmember Philseth?
Aye.
I'm a yes. Councilmember Koo? Sorry.
Yes.
And that passes unanimously. Anything else from staff here?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all so much. So we conclude item 2. Let's move on to item 3, the annual P&S committee discussion and recommendation regarding our city council protocols and procedures. Does staff have a presentation here? Or?
I do not, other than to introduce it as your annual review. Staff did not have any recommendations. Again, this can come to council if you do suggest any changes or have any updates that you require, and I'll refer to the city attorney in case she has anything else she would like to add.
Thank you, Assistant City Manager Ziesenhenny. I don't have anything specific to add, just to note that this is put on your calendar because the rules suggest that it should be, not because there's any specific problem or issue to be addressed. And we did do a comprehensive review. Council did a comprehensive review last year, and all of that material has been uploaded into the current rules. So it may be that we've kind of cleared a backlog of needs, but up to council to discuss whether there's anything else you'd like to recommend to the full council.
Okay, Councilmember Philseth.
So let me phrase this kind of as a question to the city attorney, I think. I don't feel prepared to recommend any changes to it at the moment. And so I think but you know, we had a major change this year where we went from doing stuff live to doing it remotely. And I wonder if at some point during this process, you know, somebody ought to take a look and say, you know, wonder if we need to make some changes for a more electronic world. And I'm not sure exactly how that gets done. I certainly don't want to do it tonight, right? But wonder if you got any advice or thoughts on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, 2 things you might be talking about. One might be, should we codify in some way our current COVID type of remote practices? And there has been some suggestion of that. Other people have felt that it's sort of transitory enough that we're doing fine without writing up an addendum on that. Okay. The second thing, which I think is what you mean, is, are there things that about the practices that we've had under COVID that we'd like to retain. And so that's a discussion council can have. I believe that many of the things we like about, or we have seen as advantages in terms of engaging the community and being more productive, actually will require changes in state law. And so those are things that we would like maybe the governor to think about, or the state legislature to think about pursuing as legislative change at the state level.
My beard may be very long by the time that happens. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Assistant City Manager, have you heard anything, any conversations at the league about whether cities are interested in retaining any of these practices? I suspect those conversations won't really get going in earnest until we're further into recovery, and then many councils may be returning to in-person meetings, but wanting to retain some of the advantages of the electronic meetings.
Makes sense. Okay. So not an urgent issue for us to do anything with tonight, or to recommend the council do anything with on the 30th of January.
I don't think
Okay.
so.
Okay. Thanks.
I actually have a lot of thoughts on that area, but I'll try to condense it after we go to members of the public. So I think we have at least one speaker. So if you'd like to speak on item number 3, council procedures and protocols, please hit your hand. And if the clerk could help those folks provide their comments.
Yes, of course. So again, please press *9 or raise your hand on your Zoom app, and we'll start with Rebecca Eisenberg. If you can unmute yourself, you'll have 2 minutes on the timer.
So the fact that I only have 2 minutes is demonstrative of the fact that your policies and procedures of running meetings make no sense. There's no other speaker. Why should you limit me to only 2 minutes? What I believe that you all should be doing is following the advice given by the California League of Cities guide. And if you don't know what that is, check your own website where it says here, board member and commissioner resources on your site, saying here is the California League of Cities Open and Public 5, a guide to the Ralph M. Brown Act, as well as the ABCs of open government, and you know, all of these guides, which I guess I'm the only person that actually read, state things like you shouldn't limit the community to an unduly short amount of speaking time, especially when there's no reason to limit in this community. So I think there are a lot of problems with your policies and procedures, and one is your utter lack of adherence to the rules that you claim to follow. Other rules in the California League of Cities guide include the definition of the consent agenda. You have this really bizarre rule, and please let me go beyond the 2 minutes. There's no one else speaking. You have this very odd and unusual rule that says that you need to have 3 members of your city council vote to remove an item from your consent agenda, even when an item has been improperly placed there. For example, because it's a quasi-judicial matter, which by its very nature disqualifies it for placement, according to the California League of Cities guide, disqualifies it for placement on the consent agenda. Those are examples of when it shouldn't be there, and you shouldn't need 3 full council members to object to it. Can I please point you, for example, to the rules that are followed by your sister organization, the school board, the Palo Alto School Board, which actually allows removal of their consent agenda by just 1 member of their board. And they have that rule, you know, granted they have only 5 members and you have only 7. I think that is important. Please, just one more point. As I said, the California League of Cities discourages that, and they actually say, Adrian, A, that there's direct personal liability and no actual immunity for violations of the Brown Act, and B, that limiting my time is a violation of the Brown Act, and 3, there's no one waiting. The last point. Okay, Adrian.
One more speaker, if we could please move on.
Okay, I will cede to Aram.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Aram James. If you can unmute yourself, you'll have 2 minutes on the timer.
Thank you, Rebecca. You know, I try the best I can to limit myself to the 2 minutes. That's the rules that we have right now. But, you know, as a trial lawyer, I can tell you, sometimes I feel like it's trial by ambush. I say something and I don't get to respond when, you know, like the mayor or somebody else makes a snide, offhanded comment. You know, it's just really not what we should be doing in the 21st century. I suggest that we have a little bit more vibrant interaction between council members and the citizens. Louis Brandeis said, you know, I'm thinking back to something I read that he said is that the most important participant in a democracy are not the government officials, but the citizens. And you all do everything you can, generally speaking, not to give us an opportunity to rebut stuff when what I call a trial by ambush happens, where somebody says something really foul, you know, a city council member, or inappropriate after a city council, after a citizen has spoken, we got no opportunity to rebut it. So, yeah, again, I understand this isn't the courtroom and the same rules don't apply, but I couldn't have given my clients due process, anywhere near due process, if this is the way a court of law handled itself. So let's look at options. I think that would be a priority. You know, you guys are following the rules as you understand them. Rebecca says there are broader rules out there. I have no reason to doubt that regarding the application of the Brown Act, so that we could have more interaction between, like I said, citizens speaking on critical issues and an interplay with you all to ask you questions back and forth, and still limit the overall time that council meetings go on. We could do both. So maybe that's something we need to consider going back on the list for priority discussions at the retreat next year. How can we afford our citizens more due process in our government? Good question. Let's see if we can dig into it next year. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. And if anyone else from the public would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand on the Zoom app or press *9. And Mayor Fine, we have no other raised hands.
Okay, thank you to both our speakers. I just have a couple comments on this. I don't think we need to make motions. Next year's council can alter these procedures and protocols as needed. But having run our meetings this year almost entirely remotely, I forget how many we had in person before COVID, just a couple comments. So one of the reasons I chose to move us to 2 minutes is our procedures and protocols allows up to 3 minutes per speaker. I think one of the nice things of hosting these meetings online is we've actually gotten a much wider range of participation from the community. You know, young folks, students, elderly, et cetera, joining. And thus our meetings have actually tended to run a lot longer. So I've typically tried to employ 2 minutes. We've also tried to employ time limits for council members, you know, roughly 5 minutes. I don't know if that's absolutely perfect, but it seems to work because, as Councilmember Niss has noted, there's really no visual clues that, you know, maybe one of us is going on for too long. So that's just something I've tried to work with. I'll tell you all, it is actually quite a challenge to keep track of who is in the speaking order among council, seeing the little blue hands go up and down and figuring things like that. And then when somebody makes an amendment, it actually takes, you know, I've gone through a number of notebooks this year, just tracking who's speaking and when, and I'm not perfect. So it's just something to be aware of. Sorry, let me just go through my notes a little bit more. We did talk about this, I think, when we returned from our summer break. A few of the protocols we've tried to employ. Voting, state law requires a voice vote, meaning we have to vote in sequence. As you all know, I've tried to randomize that order a little bit. It's never going to be perfect. I think, you know, if we all vote in parallel, you can't guess who's going to vote which way. But since we all have to vote by voice, we have to do it in sequence, which introduces some, you know, potential gamesmanship around voting. And so just, we should all be aware of that. As we had last night, you know, we don't have a specific rule about this, but I've tried to have at least 4 members on video to constitute a quorum of us. I just think it's good practice. Breaks are an issue. IDing speakers, I just want to thank the clerk's office for a lot of work on that. I think especially listing out the speakers in individual order is really, really helpful to us on council and also to community members. Councilmember Tanaka has brought up issues of should we have the public on video? I'm totally for that. I just think, you know, some councils and agencies have seen some issues of Zoom bombing we should be aware of. So those are a couple of my thoughts, and, you know, whether this Zoom universe continues next year or not, I would encourage next year's council to consider maybe codifying a few of those practices or what they find to support their meetings best. That's Adrian's comments after running hundreds of hours of Zoom meetings this year. Council members Phil, Seth, or Koo, any comments?
Well, I mean, this is all new to us, Mayor, so you did a really good job this whole year running the meetings and being as patient as you have been. So thank you. I did want to ask, in a committee like this, policy and services, does it have to be so regulated? So there's no, like Mr. James said, rebuttals afterwards, they can come and speak, or communications council can speak, and then for the public to have another opportunity to say whatever they want to say, and then we can kind of close at that point. Just wondering, how does that work, Ms. Stump?
Yes, thank you. So the committee does have flexibility in how it wants to handle the interaction with the public, with the caveat that there needs to be equity and fair access. So while you can ask follow-up questions to members of the public, you want to be sure that you are providing a somewhat equivalent opportunity for speech for all members. And the easiest way to do that is by a numerical limit. Some committees in the past, council committees, have allowed a longer amount of time. That has been in a time when maybe there were fewer items and it was easier to manage the time of keeping, typically committee meetings had started at 7 and finished by 9, no later than 9. So I think, there has been some concern about how to manage time. So those are all things to balance. But yes, there is flexibility, and you could do additional time or some back and forth, as long as you have fairness and somewhat equity between speakers.
Absolutely. If there's going to be the back and forth, naturally that would mean that perhaps per person who speaks, the time might be shorter too. So I mean, that's just something, like you said, to be considered, something going forward to think about. I would not want that at council meetings. I mean, that would be very much prolonged, but that's what I was just asking in this committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember Koo. I think you and I were on Rail Committee when Councilmember Walbach chaired it, and I think he did have that practice of welcoming comment, we have our discussion, maybe even make a motion, and then have the public re-engage. So I guess it's up to the chair in that regard.
But those went pretty long too.
They did. We started early and we always ended late anyways. Okay, anything else? All right. Well, I wish you all well next year discussing these policies, procedures, and protocols. Okay, let's finish up item 3. Done with that one. Future meetings and agendas. Anything from staff there?
No, we will await the new assignments in 2021. And if they're made in time, we usually plan for a February meeting.
Okay, great. Then it's 8:35 and we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Ciao.